I watched my own son smile as the judge destroyed my life. At 70 years old, I learned blood can be colder than prison steel. And that day, I stopped being a mother and became a survivor. I'm an old woman now. Child, my hands shake when I tell this story. But my memory is sharp because pain carves itself into the bones. And I remember every second of that courtroom like it's stitched into my skin. The smell of polished wood and stale air, the echo of shoes on marble, the sound of a gavel cracking down like thunder while my wrists were locked in cold metal. And I stood there wondering how the baby I once rocked to sleep had grown into the man laughing at me. Because yes, he laughed. My son laughed as the sentence was read. 3 years in federal prison for crimes I never committed. And his name was Julian Hale, a name I whispered with love for decades. A name I once kissed goodnight, and now it felt poisonous in my mouth. And beside him stood his wife, Marisol, all polished hair and sharp eyes, holding his arm like she had won a prize, smiling the kind of smile that doesn't reach the soul, the kind that's practiced in mirrors. And when the judge finished speaking and the room went quiet, Julian leaned toward her and whispered something that made them both chuckle. And I knew in that moment they weren't laughing at the system or the trial or fate. They were laughing at me, at the old woman who raised him alone after his father died, at the grandmother whose only crime was trusting her child. And when the officer snapped the cuffs tighter and pulled me forward, Julian didn't look away in shame. No, he met my eyes boldly, almost daring me to say something. But what could I say when the world had already decided I was a criminal? When strangers stared at me with pity or disgust? When even people I once called friends lowered their eyes as if guilt were contagious? And as they led me through that narrow hallway that smelled of disinfectant and despair, my knees screamed with every step because 70-year-old bones don't bend easily. But I held my head high because I refused to give them the pleasure of seeing me break. Not then, not yet. And they placed me in a small windowless room with walls the color of old paper and chairs bolted to the floor. And that's when I met Officer Grant Holloway, an older man with tired eyes and lines carved deep into his face. The kind of man who's seen too many lives fall apart behind locked doors. And he didn't look at me like a monster, he looked at me like a human being, which nearly broke me more than cruelty ever could. Because kindness hurts when you least expect it. And while he read through my papers in silence, I sat there replaying my life, wondering where it all went wrong. Remembering Julian as a little boy clutching my leg on his first day of school. Remembering nights I stayed awake when he had fevers. Remembering the promise I made at my husband's grave that I would protect our son no matter what. And how foolish that promise sounded now. Because protection only works when love is returned. And while the officer's pen scratched softly across paper, my hand slipped into the inner pocket of my old coat. The same coat I'd worn to every court date. Plain, forgettable, invisible, just like me. And hidden there was a small folded note. My last hope, my final gamble, because my son believed I was alone. He believed I had no one left. He believed the world would swallow me whole and forget my name. But there was one truth he didn't know, one secret I had kept quiet out of fear and hope and maybe a little superstition. And as Officer Holloway stood to fetch me a cup of water, I slid that folded paper onto his desk, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would betray me. And when he returned and noticed it, I watched his face change as he read the name written there. Adrian Cross, a name that carries weight in this country. A man whose shadow stretches into courtrooms and boardrooms alike. A man who, 6 months earlier, had quietly become my husband. And when the officer looked at me with disbelief shaking in his eyes and whispered that name like a prayer or a curse, I nodded slowly and told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that my son didn't know who I married, didn't know who would come looking for me, and didn't know how badly he had miscalculated. And as the officer's hands trembled and he picked up his phone, I thought of Julian again, probably celebrating somewhere expensive, toasting to my downfall, believing my life was over, believing my money and my home and my dignity now belonged to him and his wife. And sitting there with cuffs cutting into my wrists, I realized something that changed me forever. Child, betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a signature on paper, and a son who calls you mum right before he destroys you. And as the phone rang, and the officer waited for someone powerful to answer on the other end, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer. Not for revenge, but for truth, because once truth steps into the light, lies start to choke on their own breath. But what my son never imagined was how fast the truth would rise, and when it did, it didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it down, because the man answering that phone call was about to turn everything upside down. The phone rang, and the room stopped breathing. One voice on the other end changed my fate forever, and my son's lie began to collapse in silence. I remember that moment as clearly as the day I gave birth. Child, because when the officer pressed that phone to his ear, time itself seemed to pause. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than my heartbeat, and I sat there with my hands chained together, wondering if hope was about to save me or humiliate me one last time. And when the man on the other end finally answered, his voice was calm, controlled, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. "This is Adrian Cross," he said, and I swear to you my knees nearly gave out even though I was already sitting, because hearing his voice in that room felt unreal, like sunlight breaking through concrete. An officer Holloway stammered at first, struggling to explain who he was and why he was calling. And when he finally said my name, when he said, "Your wife has been arrested," the silence that followed was so thick I could taste it. And then Adrian spoke again, not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of quiet authority that makes powerful men terrifying, asking where I was, who had done this, how long I had been there. And when the phone was placed in my shaking hands and I heard him say my name softly, "Evelyn, talk to me," something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way old walls crack after holding too much weight for too long. And I told him everything in broken fragments, about Julian, about Maricel, about the forged documents and the false tears in court, about the sentence already passed, and as I spoke, his breathing changed, grew sharper, heavier, and when I finished, there was another silence. But this one was different, this one was dangerous. And Adrian said, slowly and clearly, "No one is moving my wife anywhere." And then he spoke to the officer again, issuing instructions like commands, telling him a legal team was already on the way, telling him to delay the transfer, telling him that if I so much as stepped outside that room, consequences would follow. And when the call ended and Officer Holloway looked at me with wide, stunned eyes, he whispered that the transport had been halted, that a judge had just ordered a temporary hold, and child, I don't think I had ever felt relief like that in my 70 years. Because for the first time since the gavel came down, the world wasn't crushing me anymore. It was shifting, and as we waited, minutes stretching like hours, I told the officer pieces of my story, about meeting Adrian months earlier at a quiet gallery, about how grief has a way of recognizing itself in strangers, about how we bonded over loss and loneliness, about the private wedding we kept hidden for safety and simplicity, and about the mistake I made by not telling my son, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to surprise him with happiness, and how cruel it felt now, knowing that secrecy had been used against me. And while we waited, my mind kept drifting back to Julian, imagining him somewhere laughing, spending money that wasn't his, convinced I was finished, convinced age made me weak. And then the door burst open and men in suits flooded the room, carrying briefcases and authority, led by a sharp-eyed lawyer named Caleb Marino. And behind him walked Adrian himself, taller than I remembered, his expression carved from stone. And when he saw me, He crossed the room and knelt in front of me like the floor didn't matter, taking my shackled hands into his and whispering that he was sorry, that he should have protected me sooner. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Not truly, not ever again. And what followed moved faster than my old heart could keep up with. Documents reviewed, signatures questioned, timelines dismantled piece by piece. And within hours, it became clear what Julian had thought was a perfect crime was full of cracks, because lies always rush. And rush lies always leave fingerprints, and as night fell, I was escorted not to a cell, but to a guarded home under temporary release, wrapped in safety and silence, and there, sitting on a soft couch with a warm blanket around my shoulders, I finally allowed myself to cry, not just for what had happened, but for the truth I didn't want to face. That my son hadn't just been manipulated, he had chosen this path. And when Adrian sat beside me and promised justice, not revenge, but justice, I believed him. Because power used quietly is the most dangerous kind. And somewhere across the city, Julian was still celebrating, still convinced he had buried me, unaware that the ground beneath his victory was already collapsing. But what happened next wasn't in a courtroom. It was at my son's celebration, paid for with my stolen life. And that night, I walked back into his world like a ghost he couldn't escape. I walked into my son's celebration like I had risen from the grave. Every smile froze when they saw me breathing. That's when his leaf finally met the light. I still remember the music before anything else. Child, loud and careless, and dripping with false joy. The kind of music people play when they believe nothing bad can touch them. And as Adrian guided me through the entrance of that private club, my hand resting on his arm for strength, I could feel eyes turning toward us one by one, curiosity first, then confusion, then shock spreading through the room like a crack in glass. Because I wasn't supposed to be there, I was supposed to be locked away, erased, forgotten, and yet there I was, standing upright in a deep blue dress Adrian had chosen for me, my back straight. My face calm even though my heart was pounding so hard I feared it would betray me. And at the center of the room stood Julian, my son, laughing with a glass of champagne in his hand, surrounded by people congratulating him, praising his resilience, his strength, his bravery for surviving a mother like me. And beside him, Maricel clung proudly to his side, dressed in red like a warning sign. No one noticed until it was too late. And when Julian finally felt the room change and turned his head, our eyes met, and child, I watched my son die in that moment, not physically, but the version of him who believed he was untouchable vanished, because his face drained of color so fast it was almost frightening. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, and Maricel followed his gaze and stiffened, her smile collapsing into raw panic, and whispers erupted around us, my name floating through the room like a rumor come back to life. And I took one slow step forward, then another, every step echoing with years of sacrifice and silence. And I spoke before fear could stop me, greeting Julian softly, telling him the celebration looked lovely, that it was a shame I hadn't been invited. And he stammered, demanded to know how I was there, insisted I was supposed to be in prison. And that's when Adrian introduced himself, his voice calm but carrying weight that bent the air around us. And I saw recognition slam into Julian like a wall, because Adrian's name doesn't need explaining. And suddenly Julian understood the mistake he had made, the scale of it, the kind of mistake that doesn't fade quietly. And Maricel tried to recover, tried to claim the event was private, tried to call security, but security didn't move. Because this building answered to Adrian long before it answered to her. And then our lawyer stepped forward and announced what Julian feared most, that all charges against me had been dropped, that new evidence had surfaced, that warrants had been issued. And as the words fraud, conspiracy, and perjury echoed through the stunned crowd, Julian began to shake, his anger flaring into denial. accusing everyone of lies, claiming I had controlled him his whole life, claiming the money was his by right, and child, that hurt more than prison ever could, because it told me he had rewritten our past to justify his cruelty. And as police officers entered the room and guests stepped back in silence, I looked at my son and realized there was nothing left to save, nothing left to explain, because love cannot survive where greed is worshipped. And as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he didn't cry or apologize. He looked at me with hatred, the kind that comes from being exposed. And I whispered goodbye, not as a punishment, but as an ending. Because some chapters close whether we're ready or not. And as he was led away through the same kind of doors I had passed through days earlier, I felt no victory, only clarity. And that clarity told me this wasn't over yet, because justice opens doors, but consequences finish the walk. I thought losing my son was the worst pain imaginable, until I learned what he had done to my home, and that discovery broke me in a way prison never could. Prison didn't break me. My son selling my home did. That was the moment my heart finally shattered. I thought the worst pain a mother could feel was watching her child dragged away in handcuffs. But I was wrong, because pain has layers. And the deepest one came quietly the next morning when our lawyer spread papers across the table and told me my house was no longer mine. The house where I buried my husband, where Julian learned to walk, where every wall held laughter and arguments and forgiveness, sold behind my back with a forged signature, transferred into Maricel's name weeks before my trial had even ended. And when I heard those words, my body went cold, not dramatic, not loud, just numb. Because betrayal hurts most when it is prepared long in advance. When you realize someone didn't act out of anger but calculation. And Adrian's jaw tightened as he read the documents. Dates that didn't match, stamps that looked official but weren't. A notary's name that appeared again and again like a fingerprint at a crime scene. And while legal teams moved into action, filing emergency motions and freezing accounts, I sat there remembering how Maricel once complimented my curtains, how she asked about the value of the land, how she walked through my home touching furniture like she was already measuring what to take. And that memory burned worse than the courtroom ever did, because it told me she had never seen me as a mother, only as a resource, and worse still, we learned she had been released on bail overnight using money we couldn't trace, which meant someone else was helping her, someone hidden, someone dangerous. And that fear settled in my chest like an old ache returning. Because at 70, you don't fear losing things anymore. You fear losing safety. And when Adrian asked if I wanted to see the house one last time before the court intervened, I said yes without hesitation, because I needed to face it. Needed to stand in the place where my life happened and see what greed had done to it. And when we arrived at dusk, with security watching from a distance, the door opened easily with my old key. And that's when I saw the emptiness, rooms stripped bare, photos gone, furniture missing, even the curtains torn down. And I felt like a ghost walking through my own life, touching walls that no longer recognized me, and voices drifted from the kitchen. Maricel's sharp tone mixed with a man's deeper voice, laughing about flights, offshore accounts, and leaving Julian behind to rot, and child. Hearing her speak about my son like discarded trash hurt in a way I didn't expect, because despite everything, he was still my child. And when I stepped into the kitchen and confronted her, she froze, her confidence evaporating as Adrian calmly explained how every word she'd spoken had been recorded, how every account was being frozen, how the house sale was now blocked, and when police arrived and placed her in cuffs again, she looked at me with venom and told me Julian had hated me long before she arrived, that he wanted my money just as badly, and those words stayed with me long after she was gone. Because they forced me to grieve something I had avoided grieving. The truth that the son I loved no longer existed. And as I stood in that empty kitchen and finally allowed myself to cry, Adrian held me without trying to fix anything. Because some pain doesn't need solutions, it needs witnesses. And that night, I understood something important, child. Survival isn't about revenge or power or winning. It's about standing back up after you've been stripped of everything and choosing not to become bitter. Because bitterness would have been easy, but dignity took strength. And as I left that house knowing it would never feel the same again, I also knew the story wasn't finished. Because justice had only just begun to write its final chapter, I believed the nightmare was ending. But the truth was, one final reckoning remained, and it would change my family forever. I didn't lose my son in prison. I lost him long before the trial ever began. What I found in the end was myself. The last time I saw Julian was through thick glass in a quiet room that smelled of disinfectant and regret. Child, his face thinner, his eyes restless, not with remorse, but with calculation. And when he sat across from me, hands folded like he was still trying to control the moment, he didn't apologize, didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked if there was anything I could do to reduce his sentence. And in that instant something settled inside me. Not anger, not hatred, but clarity, the kind that only comes when illusions finally die. And I told him softly that I had already done everything a mother could do, that love cannot be weaponized forever, that choices have consequences no inheritance can erase. And when he scoffed and said I had chosen power over blood, I realized how deeply he had misunderstood me. Because I never chose power, I chose truth. And as I stood to leave, he called me cruel, heartless, old, and for the first time in my life, his words didn't wound me, because they no longer defined me. And outside that facility, under a sky stretched wide and blue, I felt grief wash over me, not sharp, but heavy, the grief of mourning someone who is still alive. And it took time, long quiet days, therapy sessions I never thought I'd need, nights where I stared at ceilings listening to memories echo. But slowly, healing arrived in small ways. Morning tea on the porch of our new home, Adrian's steady presence, letters from strangers who had heard my story and found courage in it. And I began to understand that life doesn't end when betrayal happens. It transforms. And though my house was eventually returned and justice served its measured sentence, nothing returned me to who I was before. Instead, it shaped someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who finally learned that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. And now, when I tell this story, I don't tell it to shame my son or glorify my pain. I tell it so other mothers, other grandmothers, other women who have been taught to sacrifice endlessly can hear this truth, that love should never cost you your dignity, that age does not make you weak, it makes you dangerous to lies, and that even at 70, even when the world tries to bury you under shame and silence, you can rise, not loudly, not violently, but with grace. And child, if there's one thing I want you to remember from my life, it's this. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not a debt you owe someone who broke you. And as I sit here now, hands still trembling, but heart finally steady, I know my story doesn't end in loss, it ends in freedom. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance a mother leaves behind. Asterisk is not money. It's the courage to walk away from those who never loved her back. As I end this story, child, I want you to know I didn't tell it to gather sympathy or applause, but to leave behind a quiet truth that took me 70 years to learn, that love without respect slowly becomes a prison, and silence can be more dangerous than any lie spoken aloud. And if you are listening to me tonight feeling small, forgotten, or betrayed by someone you once trusted with your whole heart, remember this: you are never too old, too tired, or too broken to choose yourself, because even when the world tries to write your ending in shame, you still hold the pen. And sometimes, the bravest thing a grandmother can do is stand up, walk forward, and finally say, my story is not over yet. Asterisk.